Welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I am Kristan McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. We envision a world where the universal principles of equality, fairness, and justice prevail. 2021 is an important recognition year for Justice Jackson, for international humanitarian law, and for the Jackson Center itself. And so during the course of this year, we will be celebrating the 80th anniversary of Justice Jackson's appointment to the Supreme Court, which is coming up this coming Sunday, July 11th. We'll be celebrating the completion of the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials and the birth of international humanitarian law. And this year is also the 20th anniversary of the Jackson Center itself. All of these milestones and our planning to celebrate or commemorate them naturally had us looking to the past to see how far we, the law, and the world have come. But we also know that we have to look forward. And so it sparked internal conversations about where are we headed and how do we get there? And that's part of the story as to how we got to our programming theme for 2021, the work left to do. During this year, we will be convening conversations about democracy, US and global institutions, human rights, and equity. We have structured our teas a little bit differently this year, and each month has a particular focus. In July, we're looking at the courts and the judicial system. And we hope each of these programs inspires you to have conversations with your family, your friends, and colleagues, and to seek out ways to make change in your community. So today, I am excited to be in conversation with Shireen Crawford, co-director of criminal justice programs, and Kellsie Sayers, associate director of restorative practices from the Center for Court Innovation. For more than 25 years, the Center for Court Innovation has been working to achieve justice and equity, create safe, healthy, and thriving communities, and ultimately transform justice systems through research, creative thinking around justice systems and practices, and policy guidance and implementation. Shireen and Kellsie, thank you so much for joining me for tea today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So I like to start each of these conversations with what I consider a grounding question. And so I'm going to ask this of both of you. How do you define justice and how do you define equity? And Shireen, why don't we start with you?
Big questions. How do I define justice and how do I define equity? Well, I think on the justice question, for me and being in this work and having worked, in the justice system, I'm a former prosecutor who comes to this reform work, and I don't think it's often the typical idea of justice that we think of when we watch TV, that there's a kind of being so black and white, that there's right and wrong, and there's always a clean outcome and easy answers to what justice is. In many ways, for the communities that we work with at the Center for Court Innovation, and when you look, more broadly nationally, that justice is, a level of accountability, often also including, and Kellsie will get to talk about this, repair of harm to individual, to community, and also an opportunity for voice and for people to be heard in whatever the process is that is connected to, let's say, the injustice that's happened. And equity, I think, in speaking directly in this context, is so much about, again, voice and representation, that it's not just simply having, certain folks invited in to be there once you've brought them in, but that they're actually, helping to lead the process, to make decisions, to be the voice that says what's needed in these different justice system interventions, or the system as a whole, to really build equity, to have that balance of everyone at the table. So I think that's, I probably much more to say there, but I'll turn it over to Kellsie.
Yeah, I think in terms of justice, I think that the restorative framework for justice is, I think, how I would define it as well. And I think within a restorative framework, we see justice as a genuine expression of accountability, the reparation of harm, as Shireen mentioned, as well as the restoration of relationships. So within an RJ framework, it's inherently relational, where we see safety as the strengthening of relationships. So when we're thinking about justice, we're thinking about the ability for someone to really right their wrong, their ability for someone to face the harm that they've caused in what we consider a very active way. I think in the traditional system, accountability is seen as like taking your punishment. And that for many people is very passive. Whereas within a restorative framework, you're an active participant in deciding how you make amends and deciding how that harm needs to be repaired, and in actively restoring the relationships that were damaged as a result of like a harm cause. In the framework of equity, I would think that a lot of what Shireen mentioned is important as well. It's just like access and opportunity. So I think if you're thinking within the justice framework, you know, having access to alternatives, having access to opportunities to right that wrong and to do it again, I think is really, really, really important in an equity lens, that we don't have a justice system where, you know, we are judged by the worst thing we've ever done, and there's no opportunity for redemption, and there's no opportunity to really offer something better of yourself for the world. So I think access is a key point of equity, in that we view everyone's human life as a value, meaning that we offer ways for redemption. We offer people ways to right their wrongs.
Our audience will be familiar with a lot of the conversations we've had this year have talked about justice needing to come from the community that's been affected. And so that has sort of played through, whether we were talking about environmental justice or racial justice or gender justice, that when a wrong has been done, it's important that that community be the one who's helped defining, this is what justice means to me, versus some top down, this is what we think your justice is conversation. And I think that this feels to me like really the underpinning of how the Center for Court Innovation got started, in how are we working with these communities in order to help them both find justice and then hopefully alleviate the need for that as well. And so, you know, Shireen, when you and I were talking yesterday, I didn't realize that the Midtown Community Court, that problem solving court, was sort of the first experiment, and that the Center for Court Innovation grew out of that. So I'd love to talk about, you know, how did we get to where we are, and then we'll dive into some of the deep work that the center is doing.
Sure, I can touch on some of that. It is a long and I think pretty interesting history. So like you all are celebrating your 20th, we're celebrating our 25th this year at the Center for Court Innovation. But before the center existed, there was Midtown Community Court, and I'm not sure how many New Yorkers we have with us, but this is back in the mid to late 90s in the Times Square, you know, area of Manhattan. It looked and felt very different than it does today. Sometimes today is compared to like a sort of a Disneyland feel of tourists, and it's safe, and there's all kinds of commercial hustle and bustle in Broadway. And you know, in the late 90s, there often what was referred to as quality of life crimes were quite prevalent. And now I think we would call them often crimes of poverty, but, you know, low level sort of offenses. And in addition to, obviously, the city was experiencing much more serious violent crime at the time. And the court, you know, I you know, the history passed down to me. So I'm sure that I'm missing some of the elements, but it was, you know, a lot of great thinkers, innovative people that have gone on to do amazing things. One of them being Herb Sturz, who we lost recently, who's a leader in the field. John Feinblatt, Jeremy Travis, who used to be the president of John Jay College, you know, these folks who were you know, at the table in different ways, thinking about how can we solve for this? What can we do differently? than we've been doing. And often one of the things that comes up when people talk about the early days of Midtown is that prosecutors and judges had really limited options. It was, pay a fine, go to jail, or nothing, or maybe a probation, but there really wasn't anything else available to those, players. I guess it would include defense in that too, but prosecutors and judges for resolving these kinds of cases. So you would see the cyclical nature of things, people coming in and out, but the same sort of incidents occurring in the community. And so the court was just this really original idea of trying something different. And that's very much, I think, the basis of the center, going forward 25 years of trying something different, taking a risk, which I think is often considered to be a little bit scary in the criminal justice space. We like to do what's safe and what we think we know is kind of quote unquote the right thing to do, or the response. And so this idea generated of what if this court, had a dedicated judge and dedicated staff. And I think the biggest kind of transformative thing that's carried on is social workers in the courtroom, a different type of practitioner present to help address the issues coming before the court. And so the court, I guess I think of it in two ways. You have the community, the conditions in the community that make people, feel unsafe. And that's, across the full community, even people who may be being arrested also feeling unsafe. But also that there's the conditions in people's lives, whether it be, housing or food insecurity, mental health issues, substance abuse issues, that if you were able to offer something to address those things, could you, put some sort of slow or stop to that cyclical nature of people coming repeatedly through the system, and there only being one response of arrest, and then, these limited outcomes. And so the court really kind of stepped into this space of offering this in partnership with the court system of New York State. And so the center was built of this public-private partnership with the courts. Midtown was sort of the initial experiment, and then we've just continued to grow from there. Our second community court was the Red Hook Community Justice Center. And this idea of testing new ideas in the court space, but then we also started to test new ideas in partnership with more deeply with community that was separate from the courts. So community was always part of that court piece, but then we sort of expanded that. And with that, what has been always at the base of our principles is being able to have data and research to support what we do, to understand what we're doing, understand our impact. And then what we do more broadly is what we refer to as expert assistance or technical assistance. And so taking what we've learned and bringing it out to the world, having jurisdictions reach out to us and say, we want a community court, but obviously their community, their conditions, their issues may look different than the middle of Midtown Manhattan, right? So our teams are able to sit down with those community leaders, mayors, police, chiefs, community members, and hear and understand what are the needs of that community, how might a community court take shape there. And that's just one of many examples of our work, nationally and internationally, where we've been able to take what we've learned and share it with other jurisdictions for them to map it on for their communities to take this learning forward.
Well, and that sounds like a good transition into a discussion about restorative justice as well, since that community piece is so important. And we spoke, so last year we had Riaz Kanji with us to talk about the McGirt decision. And we talked a little bit about the peacemaking courts and how the tribal justice system differs from the traditional, the mainstream US justice system, and how there are a number of US courts that are now incorporating some of those principles into the work that we're doing. And so, Kellsie, I'd love to get your thoughts on what are some of the hallmarks of restorative justice, and then what are the goals of that?
Right. I think when you think about the hallmarks of restorative justice, I think we go back to this relational piece and this relationship piece, which is really at the heart of an RJ process. And in addition to that, it's really an intentional space that you create where there is deep listening and understanding and storytelling and connection. At the heart of RJ principles is the belief that we want to be interconnected as people, and that when we act out in an antisocial behavior, that is a demonstration of like a strain in our relationships. And that if we want to reduce harm, then we do that through strengthening our relationships. So I think the goal of a restorative process is to really center the people who are most impacted by the harm and allow them to determine how to resolve it, which I think is very different than our traditional system where the government and the state is at the center of our response to harm. If a harm happens between a community member or harm happens between people in a family, we view that as a crime against the state. Whereas within a restorative framework, we see that as an opportunity to really strengthen those relationships, where we put people in a process where we're asking the person who committed the harm to hear about the actions that they taken and the harm that was caused, and that they take steps to actively repair that harm, to make amends, and to change any patterns that may have developed that prevent that harm from happening in the future. So I think it's a really different framework with really different goals. And I think the goals are around prevention and around strengthening of relationships and healing past harms.
Is there an element of, I would say, conscious desire in this? What if it feels like a system that really only works if everybody is receptive to it? Right. So if any one of those parties is resistant, so how do you work with the communities to help them understand the benefits of this type of work?
And I think surprisingly, I feel like we haven't really worked very hard to convince the community to do it, and more so to have the system trust that the community can handle. I think inherently people want to solve their own problems. Inherently, people want to sit down with their family members, with people in their community, and hatch out the harm and talk about where the causes are coming from and how to prevent this from happening. I think we naturally do this in our own personal lives. So I think the community, it hasn't been very hard to convince them. I think that the system is now getting to a place where they're open to the idea and see the success that RJ has had, and that it's really something that people want. And with that said, it's not for everyone. So I think that it is a space where it's an intentional space. So you have to volunteer to be in that space. When we're screening cases for any of our programs, we're looking for people who want to sit down with the party who harmed them. We're looking for people who want to take accountability for their actions, who want to make amends. And, if someone is saying, hey, I didn't do it, then an RJ process isn't for you. If we have someone who's experiencing a harm who's saying, I can't sit in a process with them, I want the traditional process, then the process isn't for them. But I think that there's a large opportunity for RJ, and that there's a lot of people who really want it and are willing to participate in it.
Is this something that tends to be used with, we started talking about the Midtown Community Court and how that was really to address some of those lower level crimes. Is that where restorative justice is at this point as well? Or is it also working its way up into more severe traditional crimes?
I think RJ really exists in a range. I think that some of the lower level crimes that people think aren't a big deal, the RJ process helps people. It helps family members who may have just really gotten into a scuffle and the system got involved, but helps them heal and take steps to moving forward and strengthening that relationship. On the other end, I think that we've seen that people have really benefited, people who experienced serious harm or lost a loved one, from sitting across from the person who took their loved one away and really hearing them out, hearing their story, hearing the apologies they want to offer, hearing what they intend to do with their life moving forward, having caused this kind of harm. So I think that there's really an opportunity for RJ in lots of different spaces. And then outside of the harm context, RJ is really a great tool for use for community building. So I think that I also have experience running RJ programming in schools, where a lot of our work was really around building a healthy, open community for students, and that when they're in better relationship with each other, when someone does step on someone's foot, it doesn't erupt into the largest harm or a fight, because I know a little bit about you. You talked about your mom in circle last week. I can offer you the grace when we're in conflict because I have a better relationship with you.
That makes a lot of sense. And Shireen, you mentioned some of the data and that research. And I'm not sure if it's Shireen or Kellsie who's better equipped to address this, but how does that data function in, factor into, Kellsie, you mentioned it's other courts or the traditional system that sometimes have challenges accepting this. How is your data helping to convince them that this is a process that works?
So I think Shireen mentioned around, or maybe this was in a conversation I had with Shireen prepping for this, around just even thinking about what we're recording and how do we measure things. And I think the traditional system measures around recidivism and measures around like certain ways to decide whether or not an intervention is successful. And I think that RJ opens the opportunity to have a broader framework for that. I would say in our RJ process, we really ask people to create a reflective statement. So it's like a traditional measurement was like, would this person get arrested again for a similar crime? Is like our traditional measuring stick. And I feel like RJ offers people an opportunity to talk about like what I learned in this process, what I hope to do going in the future. And it doesn't mean that they may not have another hiccup. We all have hiccups. The idea that someone is going to automatically be changed by any magical process, I think is not realistic.
All of a sudden I'm perfect.
Right. But I think that RJ offers the opportunity for people to have voice, for people to say what's going on with us, for people to say, I'm struggling and I think I'm going to mess up again, but I'm really trying. And here are the steps that we want to take. And I think having that space is really important because it allows us to really some color to the data that I think is often very limited in how we measure the success of interventions, particularly in the legal system.
That all makes sense to me. Okay, great. Want to talk a little bit about some of the specific programs that CCI has been working on. Kellsie, you mentioned some of the restorative justice in schools, and I'd love to know, how is that? From an outside perspective, I would imagine that part of that is attempting to also disrupt the school to prison pipeline, and also perhaps just working with students so they have better responses and better skills to handle conflict. Am I at all on the right track for that?
I think all of that is correct. And I think in addition, what we wanted was a culture shift in the schools. So I think that schools, when they reach out for RJ programming, are thinking we got to fix these kids, and like the kids are the sole root of the problem. And our experience in the schools is that really for RJ to be successful is not only working with the young people, but working with the adults that interact with them every day. And what examples are adults setting about how they deal with conflicts in the school. And that does affect how young people deal with conflicts. And I think that RJ as a framework not only talks about individual accountability, but also like collective responsibility for creating conditions that foster and create harm. So in the schools we worked in, it's like, this place isn't fun. Kids don't want to come here every day. If you don't like being here and someone does something you don't like, you're more likely to react in a negative way. How do we infuse a school environment with fun activities? And we created carnivals and clubs and, look for outside funding to really booster it being a place that kids want to come to. If they want to come to the place, they care more about the place. They care more about their behavior in the place, while also teaching kids with the coping mechanisms for how to respond when you're upset and how to process harm and how to hear other people out and how to build those empathy and compassion skills I think are necessary to reduce the level of conflicts in our schools.
Kellsie, I'm wondering too, if you see that carry over in our work related to directly in the courts. Like recently we've done some restorative justice training with prosecutors. And I always think of that too, when you talk about culture shift, like asking practitioners to think differently about the community members that they're prosecuting, that they're engaging, and that the restorative justice process really ask them to do that. But I know you've kind of been more deeply involved in that.
No, yeah. And I think that in those trainings that we've been doing with the prosecutors is really like a culture shift for how we're thinking about a case. Like, what are the kinds of questions you're asking your victim? Are you asking your victim, do they want to hear from the person who's harmed them? Do they want an opportunity to have a conversation with them? Are there some things that maybe they want to share that they did when the conflict happened that they want to maybe apologize for or take responsibility for? And I can say in some of our RJ process, even when it's been really serious harm, I've been surprised how forthcoming a victim has been. Like, you really harmed me, but the way I reacted was not okay. And that people actually like the opportunity to have a human conversation about how we're showing up in spaces. So I think the culture shift in talking to the DDAs about the conversations that they're having, how are they deciding whether a case is good for an RJ process? What kind of questions are you asking folks? Because I think they'd be surprised how many people are really interested in sitting across from the person who caused them harm, because they do have a lot of questions that they want to ask and they do have a lot that they want to say. So I think that we've definitely seen it in the court setting as well.
Well, and Shireen, since you are heading up the criminal justice program, so are you seeing some of the benefit of this work in those programs. So whether it's fewer people coming through the system or different ways that we've talked about the prosecutors, but are there other ways that this is showing up on the, I guess I'll call it the criminal justice side of this, although I don't know that that's exactly the right way to characterize it.
Yeah, I think it does, you know, in what Kellsie was sharing in your question about like kind of where does RJ fit in the spectrum of the justice system, you know, and speaking directly to the programming that we do, we see RJ right now kind of all over the place, but we run a program called Project Reset that is a pre-arraignment diversion. So it's an opportunity for folks to engage in a single session, receive resources, and then be done with it. Basically, the prosecutor declines to prosecute their case. The case is sealed. There's no arrest record. And this is, I think, recognition of system actors saying, like, you know, what is the benefit of running, you know, to be in a practical sense, the expense of running a case through the system, somebody appearing multiple times for little to nothing to happen, to being able to still engage this person. In some of our programs, it is an actual RJ process that happens. In other spaces, it's more of a social service kind of working group. And then in other spaces, we also offer an arts intervention. So it looks different, opportunities for different people based on kind of need and what is kind of suitable to where that individual is at. So RJ showing up there, and then also we've seen, you know, kind of the traditional metrics of lower recidivism on those cases where a person gets this opportunity. And a lot of the feedback we get is like, you know, this idea of having a bit more trust and understanding of the system after going through the Project Reset process. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you know, we have started some work in the Supreme Court or felony space with more serious cases, more violent cases. And we're starting to kind of open the door there to look at restorative justice in those spaces. And many of the things that Kelsey's already mentioned and the benefits that both the harmed and the party doing the harm are feeling about what it means to be connected to the justice system, like just seeing it through a different lens, and that there's different opportunities than what the traditional process looks like to repair, you know, themselves and people around them. So I do think the different ways in which the center is able to touch people, I guess as you could say, coming into the justice system with, I feel like they're becoming more traditional because they're all over as far as in the New York City court system. But, you know, I guess we still refer to them as sort of non-traditional, you know, pathways in the court process.
Well, and you mentioned a word, and the word is trust, that feels like that's probably at the heart of all of this. It is, Kellsie, you mentioned it's rebuilding the trust in the community when these have happened. It's trust that the person who has, you know, perpetrated or committed this act is willing to work towards some sort of resolution. And then I have to imagine that some of the center success in expanding their programs is also the trust of the traditional system and I guess practitioners in the traditional system of, okay, yeah, we see how this is working. And so it's those ever expanding concentric circles out of, we started with this tiny thing. And as people accepted that, then we could grow and come out from there. But that trust piece seems to be at the heart of everything.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit. We started off with the conversation about the Midtown Community Court and how that has expanded into Red Hook Community Justice and a few others, but I'd love to talk about some of the work that those community courts are currently doing. So is, you know, I actually, let me take a step back first. So the Midtown Community Court is described as one of the first problem-solving courts. Could you unpack what that means?
Well, I think it kind of refers back to some of my earlier comments of problem solving in the two parts. You're doing some problem solving when you think about the impact on community and what that community may be bringing to the table. One of the things at the Midtown Community Court is they have a monthly sort of community impact meeting, and they're bringing in all folks that are part of the community in any way, business owners, residents, police officers that work in the community, and being able to identify where there's issues coming up in the neighborhood, like really on the ground. Like, we know Mr. Johnson on this corner has been showing up here and, recently every day, and then like our social workers are in the room and they're like, okay, what's going on with Mr. Johnson? Like, how do we solve for that? And then also in this idea of problem solving is looking at a very individualized approach to the person coming into the courtroom. That we're not just a case number or a docket, but who is this person? What do they need? What do they want? What is bringing them to the courtroom? And being able to kind of unpack and look at that and then offer those resources. So, at times, the resolution of the case could be, what would be a mandated session to work with, go to a group counseling session with a social worker. But often what we find is it's just really a pathway to longer term resources and linkages to other services. So that individual session with one of our staff could turn into, helping to do a housing application or helping someone build their resume or referring them to a job program. And so when we talk about problem solving, I think it's, it's layered and complex of the idea of the court being able to solve for multiple things on the individual and the community level.
With things being that individualized or that addressing being that individualized, does that require, I'm just trying to think of like, is that manageable? Like, is there a certain scale that something needs to be at in order to really facilitate that process? Is it something that you could start small and, I'm just trying to like, that feels like the perfect solution, but it also feels a little overwhelming if, rather than dealing with kind of a class of things, you have to come up with a solution for every individual person.
Yeah, I mean, it is much more labor intensive than just kind of, shuffling along and having a rote response for each, type of crime or type of person. But I think, when kind of going back to this idea of our research and seeing what works and where the impact is that there are the longer term effects for community and for individuals when you invest that extra time, attention, and detail to what is needed. And I think of that similarly with the RJ process, that it is much more labor intensive. It requires emotional labor, like real work, but the long-term outcomes are greater and longer lasting. And so I think that's one of the harder things in our society is like this instant gratification. I mean, I often think like, okay, you could just send a person to jail and then they kind of leave your community. You don't see them. You don't really, there's no one else has to do the emotional labor or the lift other, that person and their immediate family often, or it's even extended. But like what we know also, the research tells us that doesn't give us, safer communities. It doesn't give us better outcomes in the long term. And frankly, that person isn't better off when, that process is done for them. So it's kind of that challenge of getting people to see that this investment is worth it when you can't always see the results immediately.
Well, and that sounds as if it sounds as if this work is really designed to get to both the root of the person, the individual, but also perhaps the roots in the community that are enabling this to happen, or at least that are not counterbalancing it or supporting people in a way that would reduce these challenges. Am I thinking about that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. Are there any particular success stories that you would like to highlight? And Kellsie, I'm going to look at you with restorative justice first. That you think that, you know, this is really a great way to showcase just what restorative justice does.
Yeah, I can. There are definitely a bunch of success. I guess I'm thinking of a family case that we had, you know, recently where, you know, we had two family members who were really in breakdown, and, you know, cops were called, and it wasn't a serious harm, but there was definitely a disruption in the home. And we were able to bring this family together in a restorative process. And not just the two people involved, but also the other people living in the home who were like affected by them being in conflict, and really having an opportunity to sit with this family and identify like active things that they want to do as a family moving forward to prevent harm from happening in the house, to kind of talk about they had lost a loved one that everyone was really still grieving, and that was also mixed into why conflict was happening, and offering that family a space to really sit there, you know, with RJ facilitators and with community volunteers who can then share their stories. You're not the only family in conflict. I fight with my sister all the time, like, and being able to have that human connection, and then allowing people the space to come up with agreements, which is usually really a central part of the restorative process for how we're going to move forward. And, you know, out of this case, we had a young woman identify career goals and, you know, complete her GED process. And this was a very small case, and we continued to follow up with the family and see how things were going. And it really offered them a resolution that I think there's no way the traditional system could have offered what that space created for that family. So I think that that's really, really, really important.
So we have an audience question from Helena, and this feels like a good place to ask it. So, given the significant blowback that Philadelphia prosecutor Larry Krasner has received in his efforts to pursue justice, do you think there needs to be more public discussion around vengeance versus justice as the prosecutor's goal on behalf of the victim? And Shireen, this feels like this goes back to the conversation we were just having.
Yeah. So the short answer is yes. I think there needs to be more discussion around that. I've actually used recently in conversation the Larry Krasner example. Although there was great pushback on many levels, he was reelected. And so I think that says something about, you know, overall community buy-in to this idea of shifting the way, you know, the business as usual of the prosecutor's office. And I think we do need, you know, it's a culture change, you know, this idea of you've done wrong, you've hurt me, you know, and this automatic reaction that we have of what that quote unquote punishment should look like, or you know, as the individual asking the question about vengeance of, but, and I think this also really speaks to Kelsey's work, that what people really need and want when you are harmed by another person is an opportunity to be heard. And I think if we could create more space for that on so many levels, you know, from the schools to the criminal justice system, just to community, simply, you know, some of what the Center for Court Innovation does is also our, you know, community work, and being able to have that engagement before people hit the justice system, you know, like creating opportunities and spaces for this without having to have an arrest or a visit to a courtroom. And so, yes, I think we need more of that.
Well, and this I am mindful of, this feels like a hard conversation to shift, because I feel, especially if we just focus on prosecutors for a moment, so many of them run on their record of, this is how many people I convicted during my last time, or this is how many people the guy or woman who is currently in the job didn't convict. And so clearly that's been seen as the effective way to get elected. So any thoughts on how we begin to shift that conversation from, are these really the right metrics that we should be looking at? Like, is it that your number of convictions aren't important? It's more, I don't really mean the quality, like what are the circumstances around that, or how is that functioning in the community? And how do we start shifting those conversations?
I think we've had some success with just the RJ trainings that we've been offering to DAs, is that they're getting, this is the first opportunity where they can sit, and we have them actually sit in circle and like talk about how do you actually personally feel about your work, not like how does it feel when you send someone away? How does it feel when you're talking to victims? Is this why you came to the job? And we had a lot of them share that like they thought the job was going to be completely different, and they see the limitations, and not that they want to get rid of the entire system. They see that there's a place for it, but that there's a huge gap that's not being filled currently, and that we need more options. We need other alternatives from the traditional system. So I think that just offering spaces for the DAs to be reflective. And I think that naturally we are a reactionary culture. And that when you sit back and you reflect on the work you're doing and what your goals are, I think that there's lots of opportunities to shift culture just by having those conversations.
And I think to add to what Kellsie has said, and this question, I have a strong belief personally that to really change the way our criminal justice system works, it requires a change of the prosecutor. And I think to this point of the metrics is huge. It's like what gets measured gets done, what gets measured is deemed success. And I've seen some really impressive things from prosecutors' offices in the last, I would say, like, 7 to 10 years, but especially in the last few years. And I don't know, if you follow the Manhattan DA's race, which is not quite over, but I mean, it was a pretty packed field, and what folks were standing on was all reform, like what they were not going to prosecute, how they were going to reduce budgets. And I think if you did, whatever, if we looked at this 30 years ago, it was exactly what you pointed out, Kristan, is like how many convictions, how long were, those sentences for those folks, and now like it's really the pendulum is shifting. It's like to stand up and try to be elected. You're having to, kind of put forward a new set of criteria for how you'll do the job. And I've seen also like there's the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution, which is like serving as sort of a hub for elected DAs to come to and get information and resource about how to do things differently. And they recently, it's been a lot of big urban cities, right, that are able to do this. But I saw that recently they started a campaign, I think it's called Beyond Big Cities or something to that effect. So like these smaller jurisdictions that are often, a bit more conservative, that are also wanting to find these tools to have different metrics. And I think just the last note on that, I was excited to hear in the current Manhattan DA's office, what they're asking. They used to always measure like how many trials have you had or how many convictions, kind of thing traditionally. And now they're asking in their kind of reviews of their line assistants, like how often are you offering an alternative to incarceration? How often are you going out to speak with community? So, I imagine that it will take years to really have that culture change there. But like those things seem to be introduced.
And I have to imagine part of that goes back a little bit to that ripple effect that I was talking about earlier too, that you have to see it in some place first before you perhaps want to adopt it in your community to get a sense of how successful is that going to be, or how are people receiving it. And so that also feels like something that would be most likely to start in a larger city that is dealing with volumes of this, and then sort of hopefully ripple out from there into smaller communities. And then each community has to figure out like, how does that work in their space as well. You mentioned that you do a lot of consulting work with other communities as well about these principles and how this could work in those communities. Could you share a little bit about those conversations as well, and what you're seeing, or what other communities are working on or working towards?
Yeah, Kellsie, you want me to?
Sure.
Take that? So, I mean, I think we see this in a lot of different spaces. I think the one example that's coming to mind, just because it's been very present, is the program I referenced a little bit earlier about pre-arraignment diversion. And the work we do there, specifically in Brooklyn, we do in partnership with the Brooklyn Museum. And this last year, through the pandemic, we've had probably a half a dozen museums or city entities reach out to us to learn more and understand sort of like this idea of like offering some civic engagement, offering a cultural institution that's, partnering with, in most cases here, a prosecutor's office, to offer this off-ramp for folks who, generally it is kind of folks being arrested for lower level offenses. But from LA to New Orleans, to Boston, different museums and prosecutors' offices coming to us and saying, like, how did you do this? How did you set this up? What were the challenges? Where are the successes? And just some of the real mechanics of it, like trying to figure out how it works for their community. And so that's a pretty cool thing to see, these major arts institutions kind of thinking about how they can be part of the solution and creating kind of new and innovative ways to address these issues.
It doesn't feel like a natural partnership, or an expected partnership might be a better way to think of it. I mean, obviously a lot of the cultural institutions are some of the larger institutions in their various cities or towns. So it's not outside, but just having that focus coming from that cultural side of things feels both welcome and unusual to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is too for the folks that we come into contact with. They're like, wait, I can go and like think about the decision I made and what I need and want in my future, and visit a museum, and my criminal case goes away. They're like, this can't be right. This can't be true. And so, it is really, kind of challenging everyone's thinking about different ways to resolve cases.
Almost feels like a different, an upscale version of art therapy almost. All right, so I want to remind our audience to please ask your questions as they are occurring to you. But I also want to talk with you, get your opinions on what are we not paying attention to with regard to this work that we should be? Like, what are some of the things that keep you up at night, or that you are thinking like, oh, this would be really cool if this happened, or this is coming next? Kellsie, I'm going to start with you.
I've got to think about that. I think that I'm actually in a really excited space for the work. I feel that I came into this field a little over 4 years ago. I was a public defender for a couple of years and really was looking for another opportunity to really work within the justice system. So I see for me is that there actually is this huge space where we're thinking about RJ in every space possible. I think that there was a time where it's like, this can only be on low level cases. We could never use this on a serious case. And a lot of the requests I'm getting now are for felony cases, for cases that last year you could not convince me that offices would be reaching out on whether we had programming or we had something to offer. So I think that I'm having a hard time imagining where we're missing it right now, because the work has really been flowing in for us. I think the place where we can use a lot of growth is the community space. And I think that we're spending some time now thinking we've got a series of projects within the system, but around like how to empower communities to really hold that space. I'm thinking we have an RJ reentry program that's coming soon, that's going to be at one of our community sites where people are coming home from serving some pretty long sentences. And we want to empower their friends and their family and their community to like engage with them and set up a plan for them to be successful. So I think the space that I'd really like to see continue to grow is really allowing communities to hold this, and that it's not predominantly within the justice system in the way that I see a lot of growth happening there, and the growth for the community is a little slower.
That reminds me of a conversation we had with David Crane, who was the chief prosecutor for the Special Court of Sierra Leone. And part of what he talked about with that was he spent a lot of time talking with the various communities, one, to understand what their definition of justice was, but two, to facilitate those conversations. And in this particular instance, between some of the child soldiers and the communities that they came from and were trying to go back to, and trying to figure out like how are these people reintegrated into this community. And obviously Sierra Leone, different resources than a lot of places that we're talking about in the US. Like what support does the community need in order to work through these challenges, I guess is the best way of thinking about it, of reincorporating people who have perpetrated some, in this instance, gross crime against them. Okay, yeah. Shireen.
Yeah, so I think the three things I've named three things that surface for me when you say what's missing or what do we need to spend more time on. I think violence. I think we need to, as a as a community, as a system, think more about what it means when violence is committed, who's committing that violence, why it's happening, and what our reaction is. Some of our colleagues recently put together a study that folks could find on our website, and they actually had a nice interview on NPR yesterday about why young people carry guns. And I think there's some really insightful things in there, and that's just looking at like the carrying of gun, not actually causing harm there. But I think to deal with mass incarceration and the issues that the center focuses on, is we have to look more deeply at violence. I think the second thing, which we've already talked about, is we need to pay more attention to prosecutors, what they're doing, how they're doing it, why they're doing it. And then something, when you said keeps you up at night, is I find that as a culture, we have a great deal of kind of patience and second chances for young people, as we should, right? Developing young people. But many of the adults that we work with and we see, they were young people who never got what they needed. And they've just simply aged, and they still need those things, maybe in a slightly different way. And I think, this idea that if you've reached a certain threshold in age, therefore the second, third, or kind of fourth chance ideas disappear when you've never gotten your needs met, and you've been in sort of marginalized spaces your entire life, is a deficit that I think we have to be willing to confront.
Shireen, hearing you say that made me think of one thing that I have spent some time thinking about, is that we see a change in the justice system in terms of how we respond and what's a case worth, and the fact that there are people who are incarcerated and have been incarcerated for long periods of time when we thought differently. And I don't think we're having a conversation about how to bring those people home, how to reintegrate them into our world where, 10 years ago it was worth 7 years and now it's probation, and there are people still sitting there. Yep. And we can't say that it's no longer worth that, and that, well, those people, back then it was. And are we thinking creatively about actually not just stop sending so many people to prison, but how do we reduce the existing prison population and allow people to go home, and allow them to go home in a way that's successful? How do we create a system where they can re-enter a world that's very different than the world that they left, and set them up to actually be successful? I think is a conversation that we haven't even really begun to have, that I think is incredibly important if we're talking about holistically valuing everyone's lives, and not just the people coming into the system now, but those who really came into the system a lot earlier when we thought differently about individuals and about cases and about harm.
Yeah, so that leads me to two thoughts. One is how do we allow for growth? And I think I can't remember if it was Kellsie or Shireen, you said something early on of, somebody does something and they're working with the community and allows them to grow and to mature in their responses and in their reactions to things. And Shireen, what you were just describing seems like at a certain point we cut off and be like, look, if you haven't learned by now, there's probably no way you're going to learn, which is obviously, erroneous, that we keep learning every day, hopefully. And so how this, I feel like these are some of the big questions, like how do we enable that space for growth? How do we enable both that acknowledgement of, yeah, that wasn't okay, but I am both committed to doing better and have been actively showing that I am doing better than I was then, because I know more now than I did then. Is that something also some of your research is showing, or things that the center, it feels, Kellsie, part of that larger thing that you were just talking about of like, are we actively going back and taking a look at how did we do things 5 years ago? And does that still make sense? And how do you have the manpower, person power to start addressing that?
I think that's a difficult question. I think it goes to the part around sort of collective responsibility, because I think part of the way that we allow for growth is really asking ourselves those difficult questions about what environments do we as a society and as a community have we created that continue to kind of foster harm and foster the behavior, the antisocial behaviors that we don't want? So I think that if we sit back, if I'm thinking about, work with young people, and in an RJ practice, we get to talk about what's going on in the classroom, like what's happening with that educator who's trying their best, but like there are limitations. If I remember in one of our schools, a lot of the altercations were happening in the same hallway. And I'm like, this cannot just be the young people. There is an adult problem that's happening if it's all happening in the same space all the time. Like, what are the educators in this corridor? What are their classroom management skills? Like, what's happening there? So I think that we allow space for growth when we allow the individual to grow, but also as a society, we say, how do we need to grow? What are the improvements that we need to make? Because I think we often have a lot more grace for ourselves and the people that we love than we have for people that we've othered. And I think that RJ requires you're no longer allowed to other that person. You have to hear their story. You have to hear the conditions that they're living in. You have to hear the needs that they have that are unmet. And when you're doing that, it really does open us up to want to give the person the opportunity that they do need to grow. And I think that that's both a reflection on the person and also just who we are as a collective.
Makes sense. All right, we are approaching our last 4 minutes. So I'm going to start the lightning round. Okay, Shireen, I'm going to start with you. What progress do you hope to see in the next year I can limit it to the criminal justice space if that's easier, in the criminal justice space?
Lightning round and then really good question. I think for me, it is what I think everyone has raised up and that I hope that can really continue since the murder of George Floyd, this idea of thinking about race and equity and inclusion across, I see the court system thinking about it. I see DA's offices, I see, defense, community organization, but I really hope that momentum can continue and that we really think about deeply those inequities in the system and the history that's brought us to where we are. And it's not just a blip in time.
Okay. And then I'm going to ask the follow-up question. And then Kellsie, I'll ask you these same 2 questions. What gives you hope that progress will be made?
I guess, shameless self-promotion here, but what gives me hope is, working at the Center for Court Innovation, frankly, it suits the way I think change happens in this really collaborative fashion, that everyone is at the table, even if we disagree, even if it takes longer, but there's this relentless engagement to make the system more equitable, more fair. And that gives me hope.
Sounds like you are working through that fundamental separation from the instant gratification, that sometimes the fact that the process takes longer is often a deterrent to working through that. All right, Kellsie, what progress do you hope to see in the next year?
I hope to see the continual engagement with communities. I think that, RJ is relational and we talk about relationships. And I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, is how important our relationships are in all of these spaces that we weren't always able to see how important those relationships are. So I think continuing to engage the community and to bring them to the table and deciding how we're resolving issues and what way we need to move forward, that I'm excited about what we're going to do in that area in the next year.
Okay. And then what gives you hope that progress will be made?
What gives me hope is the conversation. I think that we're having conversations, and be that as a result of the movement around, George Floyd's death, we're having conversations we haven't had before with everyone. And I think that we may have been having these conversations with sort of our close-knit group of friends, but now this is a public conversation. As a community, we are talking about how do we solve these issues? How do we address the inequities within the system? And that really gives me a lot of hope that, I've been in this space for a number of years, and it used to feel like my friends were like, yeah, Kellsie does this stuff. And now it's the stuff that I do that everyone's talking about at the dinner table gives me hope that we're really making some progress in sort of improving the system for everyone.
I can see why that would. Okay, Shireen, who else is doing good work to drive towards progress?
Oh, so many folks. Gosh, I think a couple organizations that come to mind is Color of Change. I mentioned the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution. Our colleagues at the Vera Institute, I think, are doing great things. And then I think there's a lot of good conversation in sort of the academic world, kind of putting this out there where people are reading and learning and engaging.
Okay, Kellsie.
I think Shireen named a lot of sort of the important institutions. I think that there's a lot of RJ practitioners, small practitioners around New York City who are really engaging this work and really, nationally. So yeah.
All right, then Kellsie, I'll start with you for the final lightning round question. We like to leave our audience with people they should be thinking about, reading, watching, listening to. So any recommendations on books, articles, podcasts, thinkers, Netflix videos, whatever it is?
I think that the center has, and that's a plug, has some amazing things that I think continue the conversation we're having. I think around RJ, we didn't really discuss intimate partner violence, but we've really been a part of the policy conversation around it. And I think we have a really good report, a national report on the intersection of inter-partner violence and RJ across the country. There's a really cool Restorative Justice in Schools podcast with my team talking about this work in schools. So I would say check out the center because there's just a wealth of information and reports that we have that really talk a lot about this work.
Okay, perfect. And Shireen, your recommendations?
Podcasts, the Center's New Thinking. I would definitely, like Kellsie, plug that. The RJ team has one on there, but we also have a recent podcast that just released talking about policing. And I like the podcast Ear Hustle, just like kind of the humanity of people who have been incarcerated. And then as far as just top of mind right now, book, Emily Bazelon, who wrote the book Charge that came out a couple years ago, maybe more now. Time is a funny thing, but I would recommend that as a good read.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us for tea today. A couple of upcoming programming notes so you can mark your calendars. And these are all free programs. Thursday, July 22nd is the Robert H. Jackson Lecture on the Supreme Court. That's at 1:30 p.m. on Thursday, the 22nd. This program is held annually at the Chautauqua Institution, and this year's lecturer is Melissa Murray, the Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at NYU's School of Law, and she's also one of the voices behind the Strict Scrutiny podcast, which is one of my favorite court podcasts. And she will be in conversation with Professor John Q. Barrett, Professor of Law at St. John's University, and the Jackson Center's Elizabeth S. Linnae Fellow, and also a board member. You can register for that event free on our website, roberthjackson.org. And if you already subscribe to the Chautauqua Assembly platform, you will have access to that lecture there. And again, there will not be a tea on that particular Thursday. That would be another typical Thursday for tea. So this program will take the place of that. And then on Monday, July 26th, that's the 75th anniversary of Justice Jackson's closing statement at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. And Brian Garner, lawyer, grammarian, lexicographer, and the author of more than 25 books, will join us to share his thoughts on Justice Jackson's prose and the language used in the closing statement. That program is at 3 p.m. on Monday, the 26th, and you can also register for that free webinar on our website. And then if you happen to be in Southwestern New York on Wednesday, July 21st, the Jackson Center is the featured guest at the Roger Tory Peterson Institute's Art After 5. And you can register for that event on their website, which is rtpi.org. Shireen and Kellsie, thank you so very much for joining me for tea today and for sharing the work of the center and for challenging us and really helping us think through some of these things. We know this work never really ends, and so we always have to keep doing the work. And I really appreciate you all sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.